that King Charles has not issued an Easter message this year to the Christian community.
The unfortunately timed Christian snub from the head of the Church of England has renewed concerns that Charles is more sympathetic to Islamism.
He stood beneath the ancient arches of Westminster Abbey, swore before God, and assumed a role deeply tied to Christianity. Yet, on Easter Sunday, the very heart of that faith, King Charles III delivered a message without speaking a single word. No voice, no personal note, just silence that echoed louder than any speech. And that silence didn't go unnoticed. It raised eyebrows, stirred frustration, and left many asking what it truly meant. Was this a simple oversight, or something far more deliberate? Drop your thoughts below, because this might not be what it seems. The Easter silence that sparked a royal controversy. King Charles stands in a position unlike any other. He is not just a monarch. He is the supreme governor of the Church of England, a figure whose public identity is deeply tied to faith, tradition, and centuries of religious history. This is the same man who stood inside Westminster Abbey, made a sacred oath before God, and accepted a role that is inseparable from Christianity itself. So when Easter arrived, the most important moment in the Christian calendar, people expected something. Not a grand spectacle, not a long speech, just something. But what they got instead was nothing. And that silence didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate, because sometimes saying nothing says more than any carefully written speech ever could. Easter is not just another date on the calendar. It is not like Christmas with its lights and gifts and festive cheer. Easter is the foundation of the Christian faith, the resurrection, the core belief that everything else rests upon. For over 2,000 years, it has shaped cultures, traditions, and entire nations. And yet, on that very day, the man whose role is rooted in that faith appeared to step back, as if the moment didn't require his voice at all. That's what makes it so striking, because just weeks earlier, the tone had been very different. In February, the royal family's official platforms shared warm, thoughtful messages to Muslims across the United Kingdom and beyond, marking Ramadan with care and attention. The words were clear, personal, and intentional. They reached out not just as a formality, but as a gesture of recognition and respect. And then came Shrove Tuesday, a day that belongs to the Christian calendar, marking the beginning of Lent, the spiritual journey leading directly to Easter itself. Yet even on that day, the spotlight shifted again. Instead of highlighting its Christian significance, the focus remained elsewhere. The messaging continued, the greetings continued, and the warmth was unmistakable. Then at a state banquet, the same pattern repeated: public acknowledgments, kind words, visible engagement. It painted a picture of a monarch who was present, aware, and willing to speak, just not when it came to Easter. So when Easter Sunday finally arrived, expectations weren't unrealistic. They were based on what had already been shown. People had seen the effort, the consistency, the willingness to acknowledge important religious moments. They assumed Easter would be no different. But instead, what appeared was a simple social media post. No personal signature, no direct message, no sense that it came from the king himself. Just a polished graphic, something that could have been created by any media team. And strangely, within that image was something that felt out of place, a cartoon chicken hatching from an egg. For a moment meant to represent the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it struck many as oddly disconnected, almost trivial. And that's where the questions began to grow louder. Because this wasn't just about one message or one missed opportunity. It was about contrast. It was about timing. It was about the difference between when a voice is used and when it isn't. People started asking whether this silence was simply coincidence or whether it reflected something deeper. After all, patterns don't form by accident. They are built through repeated choices. And that leads directly into the first line of defense that quickly emerged. Some argued that Easter messages have never really been a strong royal tradition, that even Queen Elizabeth rarely gave one, except under very specific circumstances. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. It explains a way to downplay the significance of what didn't happen. But there's one detail that complicates that argument. King Charles himself gave an Easter message the year before, which changes everything, because the moment he chose to do it, he set a new expectation. He created a pattern where none strictly existed before. And when you create a pattern, people notice when it breaks, especially when the break happens under circumstances that make the contrast impossible to ignore. So if it wasn't tradition guiding the decision, then what was? And if that silence was a choice, as it increasingly appears to be, then what does that choice really say? Not just about Easter, but about priorities, messaging, and the role of the monarchy in a changing world. Because if this is only the first explanation being offered, let's examine the second defense, and you will realize that it raises even more unsettling questions. Stay tuned. The forgotten balance. There's a growing tension quietly unfolding, and at first glance, it almost seems like a misunderstanding. A king trying to embrace everyone, a country proud of its diversity, a leader attempting to speak to people of many beliefs, many traditions, and even those with none at all. On the surface, that sounds fair, reasonable even. After all, modern Britain is no longer shaped by one single voice or one single faith. But then something deeper begins to stir. Because while no one is asking for exclusion, what many are noticing is something else entirely, an imbalance that's becoming harder to ignore. It's not about rejecting one celebration or silencing another. It's about something much simpler. If one moment is recognized with warmth, shouldn't another receive the same care? Think about it. When a leader takes the time to send heartfelt words during one holy period, filled with personal warmth and thoughtful expression, it shows intention, it shows presence, it shows respect. And when that same effort seems to vanish during another equally important moment, people begin to ask questions. Not out of anger, but out of confusion. Because this isn't about grand speeches or long ceremonies, it's about something far smaller, yet far more symbolic. A message, a few words, a sign that the moment matters. And yet, when Easter arrived, a day many consider the very heart of the Christian calendar, there was no personal message, no direct voice, no clear acknowledgement from the very figure who stands at the top of that tradition. Instead, what appeared felt distant, almost impersonal, something that could have been put together by anyone, without thought, without feeling. That's where the discomfort begins. Because the same voice that delivered deeply personal, carefully chosen words during another religious moment suddenly fell silent here. The same man who clearly knows how to craft meaningful messages seemed, for this one occasion, nowhere to be found. And the explanations? They only added fuel to the confusion. We're told it was simply a matter of timing, a busy schedule, too many commitments, too little room. But that reasoning feels thin. Because what does it really say when one of the most important days in the Christian year cannot find even a few minutes of space? It raises an uncomfortable thought. Was it truly about time, or was it about priority? Then comes another curious detail. When the silence began to draw attention, who stepped forward to calm the growing unease? Not a leading figure from within the Church of England itself, the very institution tied directly to the crown, but someone outside that structure entirely. A voice disconnected from that historic bond, offering reassurance that everything was fine, that nothing meaningful had been lost. But for many watching closely, it didn't feel fine. Because when you step back, this moment doesn't stand alone. It starts to connect with a wider pattern, one that has been quietly forming over years. A slow shift where certain traditions, once central, once unquestioned, are now treated differently, more cautiously, more distantly, almost as if acknowledging them too strongly might cause discomfort. And yet, that same caution doesn't seem to apply across the board. In public spaces, expressions of some faiths are openly celebrated, encouraged, and protected. Leaders go out of their way to show awareness, to speak with care, to demonstrate respect. But when it comes to Christianity, something changes. The tone softens, the visibility fades. And when questions are raised, the response often isn't understanding, but dismissal. Why make a fuss? They say. But perhaps the better question is, why does it feel like only one group is being asked not to? Because for a country whose laws, traditions, and even calendar have been shaped so deeply by Christian roots, this shift feels significant. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, subtle. and all the more powerful because of it. And at the very center of it all stands the king himself, a figure bound not just by tradition, but by title, a title that carries weight, history, and expectation. But what happens when that role begins to feel uncertain? When the balance it promises starts to tilt in ways no one can quite explain? Let's unravel every detail. The monarchy's quiet shift. There's something important that needs to be said carefully, because in today's world, the moment you raise a sensitive issue, it gets twisted and turned into something you never meant. So let's be clear from the start. This is not about dismissing other religions. It's not about saying one group matters more than another. No one is arguing that Ramadan should be ignored, or that Muslims in Britain deserve any less respect. That's not the point at all. The real issue sits much deeper than that. At the heart of it is the simple truth about the British monarchy. Its identity is not floating freely between beliefs. It is rooted firmly and historically in Christianity. This isn't opinion. It's built into the institution's structure. The coronation ceremony is not just symbolic. It is a deeply Christian ritual. The oaths taken are Christian. The monarch doesn't just represent the nation. He holds the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England. And that connection is not accidental. The Church exists in its current form because of the crown. And the crown, as we know it today, exists because of the Church. They are tied together in a way that cannot simply be rebranded without consequence. So when people begin to notice a shift, when it feels like that connection is being quietly pushed aside, it raises questions. Not loud questions, but quiet ones that linger. Questions about priorities. Questions about identity. Because what happens when a monarch appears to place more weight on being seen as inclusive than on fulfilling the role that defines his position? Over time, it seems that a different way of thinking has taken shape, a broader, more modern outlook. One where the monarch doesn't just stand as a Christian figurehead, but almost like a bridge between religions. A kind of spiritual representative for everyone. It sounds noble. After all, who wouldn't admire someone trying to bring people together? And to be fair, there's no reason to doubt the sincerity behind it. The respect for different faiths seems genuine. The interest in dialogue feels real. But sincerity alone doesn't always lead to the right outcome, because there is a quiet line between respecting all beliefs and stepping away from your own. And when that line starts to blur, something important can be lost. When a monarch begins to treat the Christian foundation of the role not as a strength, but almost as something uncomfortable, something to soften, it creates a contradiction. It starts to look less like inclusion and more like a quiet form of erasure. Not loud, but subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless you're really paying attention. And that's what makes it difficult to challenge, because it comes wrapped in the language of unity and openness. It sounds good, it feels right, but underneath, it may be slowly weakening the very thing it claims to protect. Even voices from within royal circles have begun to hint at this tension. Some have gone as far as questioning whether the monarchy still holds the same purpose it once did. That might sound extreme, but the concern is worth thinking about, because the monarchy isn't just held up by laws or tradition. It rests on something deeper, a shared understanding between the institution and the people, a belief that it stands for continuity, stability, a connection between the past and the present. But what happens when that sense of continuity starts to feel selective? When certain traditions are emphasized, while others, especially the ones at the core, seem to fade into the background? That's where the real tension begins. Because if the monarch carries the title of head of the church, but treats that responsibility as little more than a formality, then it raises a bigger question no one seems eager to answer. Can you still claim that identity if you no longer fully live it? Can the crown continue to draw its legitimacy from something it appears increasingly distant from? You can't stand on both sides forever. You can't rely on the church to give the monarchy its meaning, while at the same time treating its most sacred moments as optional. And maybe that's why people are starting to look more closely, not just at what is being said, but at what is being quietly left unsaid. Because when you compare the tone, the message, the subtle signals being sent today, something feels different, which brings us to a moment that many overlooked, but perhaps shouldn't have. Last year's Christmas speech compared to this year, what changed? What was missing? And what does that silence really reveal? Keep watching to find out. The Easter message that changed everything. Last Easter, something remarkable happened. King Charles III didn't just release a routine royal message. He spoke in a way that felt deeply personal, almost intimate. His words carried weight. He reflected on the story of Jesus, not in a distant or ceremonial tone, but in a way that felt alive and meaningful. He described the powerful image of humility, Jesus kneeling to wash the feet of those who would later abandon him. It wasn't just storytelling, it was a reminder of sacrifice, forgiveness, and a kind of love that refuses to give up, even when betrayed. He spoke about a love without limits, a love that gives, even when it hurts, a love that stands firm, even in the face of death. And at the center of it all, he pointed to something simple yet profound, the idea that Easter is not just a tradition, but the very heartbeat of Christian belief. His message was clear. This was about faith, about hope, and above all, about love. Not just any love, but the greatest kind, the kind that changes lives. And then, as if sealing that message with quiet sincerity, he ended with a blessing, a peaceful, heartfelt wish for his people. It felt like a king speaking directly to those who shared that faith. It felt intentional. It felt present. Now fast forward 1 year. This Easter, something felt different. Gone was the depth. Gone was the reflection. Gone was that unmistakable sense of presence. Instead, what appeared was something far lighter, far less personal, something that left many people pausing, not in reflection, but in confusion. Where there had once been a thoughtful message, there was now something that didn't quite carry the same emotional weight, and perhaps more striking than what was said, was what wasn't. No clear voice, no unmistakable signature, no strong sense that the message came directly from the king himself. And that shift didn't go unnoticed. Because for millions of Christians, Easter is not just another holiday on the calendar. It's not about long weekends or chocolate eggs or seasonal traditions. It is deeply personal. It's the reason families wake up early on Sunday mornings, dress in their best, and gather in quiet churches filled with hymns that echo through generations. It's about belief, identity, meaning. These are not fringe voices. These are not people standing on the edges of society. These are individuals who, for decades, centuries even, have formed a strong and loyal foundation beneath institutions like the monarchy. They have supported it, believed in it, and in many ways, helped sustain it through changing times. So when that same group looks at a royal Easter message and finds themselves asking a simple but powerful question, did the king actually speak to us? That question carries weight, because it's not about outrage. It's not about conspiracy theories or dramatic assumptions. In fact, some of the louder claims floating around, like suggestions of religious conversion, are easily dismissed and don't hold real ground. But what cannot be dismissed is something far quieter, far more subtle. Confusion, a genuine, almost uneasy uncertainty from people who expected to hear a familiar voice and didn't. And that raises a deeper issue, because sometimes it's not bold statements that signal change. Sometimes it's absence, silence, a shift in tone so subtle that it almost slips past unnoticed until you compare it to what came before. What changed in just 1 year? Was it a deliberate decision, a careful adjustment to avoid appearing too closely tied to one faith in an increasingly diverse society? Or was it something else entirely? A quiet recalibration behind palace doors, where the balance between tradition and modern image is constantly being negotiated? Because here's the reality. Decisions like this don't exist in a vacuum. Even something as simple as an Easter message carries meaning. It sends signals, intentional or not, and those signals ripple outward, shaping how people feel about the institutions they once trusted without question. And perhaps the most unsettling part isn't anger. It's distance, that growing feeling that something once clear is now becoming blurred, that something once rooted is slowly loosening its grip. To understand what is really unfolding, you have to look beyond a single Easter message and examine something far deeper, the long-standing bond between the Church of England and the British Crown. Stay glued. The Crown and the Church. This is not just symbolism or tradition. It is a constitutional relationship that has shaped Britain for centuries. The monarch is not only a political figure, but also the supreme governor of the Church of England. a role that carries spiritual responsibility as well as national significance. For generations, this connection has helped define the identity of the monarchy itself, anchoring it in Christian belief and practice. At the center of this discussion stands the modern figure of King Charles III, whose approach to faith appears different from his predecessors. Unlike previous monarchs, Charles has openly expressed interest in inclusivity and interfaith dialogue, presenting himself as a unifying figure for people of all religions. While this intention may seem progressive, it introduces a subtle but powerful shift in how the monarchy relates to its original religious foundation. Because when a role that was historically tied to one faith begins to stretch toward all faiths, it raises a pressing question: what happens to the original one? To truly grasp the weight of this shift, it helps to look back at Queen Elizabeth II. Her reign was marked by a quiet but unmistakable devotion to Christianity. Her speeches often reflected deep biblical references, and her public role consistently aligned with the spiritual expectations of her position. She embodied the idea that the monarchy and the church were inseparable, each reinforcing the authority and legitimacy of the other. For many people, she represented stability, continuity, and a clear connection between faith and leadership. Now contrast that with what is being observed today. Under King Charles, there is a visible emphasis on inclusivity, global awareness, and religious harmony across multiple faiths. Messages to different religious communities are often warm, personalized, and publicly emphasized. Yet this has led some to feel that the original Christian foundation of the monarchy is being softened or even sidelined. The absence of a strong personal Easter message, especially from someone who holds a deeply symbolic religious role, has intensified that perception. This contrast between two monarchs is not simply about personality, it reflects a broader transformation in how the monarchy defines itself in a modern, diverse society. Where Elizabeth's reign reinforced a clear religious identity, Charles appears to be steering toward a more pluralistic vision, but that shift carries consequences. Because the monarchy does not exist in a vacuum, it draws its authority, at least in part, from the historical and spiritual traditions that support it. If those traditions begin to fade or lose prominence, the monarchy risks losing part of the very foundation that gives it meaning. This is where the tension becomes unavoidable. The Church of England has long depended on the Crown for its leadership, while the Crown has depended on the Church for its legitimacy. They are two institutions bound together in a delicate balance. But if that balance begins to shift, if one side becomes less visible or less prioritized, the entire structure may begin to feel unstable. At the same time, public expectations are changing. Society today is more diverse, more global, and less tied to traditional religious frameworks. Leaders are now expected to represent everyone, not just one group. So when a monarch emphasizes inclusivity, it can be seen as adapting to the times. Yet, that adaptation comes with trade-offs, especially when it touches the core of a centuries-old institution. So, what's your take on King Charles' silence? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.